I feel like I am drowning. Have you ever been in a situation in life where it seems like it is battering you wave after wave after wave after wave, and you feel like you are dead in the water?
Some of you are sinking. And listen to the words that David wrote. David was a poet. In 2 Samuel 22, 5 through 7, he says this: "The waves of death overwhelmed me. The floods of destruction swept over me. The grave wrapped its ropes around me, and death laid a trap in my path." And so he takes his torment and he turns it into poetry. He turns it into a song. And he says, the waves of death, they overwhelmed me. Floods of destruction, they swept over me. The grave wrapped its ropes around me. Death laid a trap in my path. But in my distress, I cried out to the Lord. Yes, I cried out to God for help. Why? Because even the toughest warrior fights battles he can't win. My cry reached his ears, and he reached down from heaven, and he rescued me, and he drew me out of the deep waters. Here's the good news. No matter how deep you are, no matter how far you've sunk, God can still reach you. You got to cry out. You got to call out. You got to say, God, save me. God, save me. God, I need you. If the waves are overwhelming you, if the storm is too big, I want to remind you what Psalms 89:9 says. It says, you rule the oceans. It's not you, it's God rules the oceans. Your God, my God, is bigger than our storms. He's bigger. He's greater. He is grander. It says, you rule the oceans. You subdue their storm-tossed waves. You do, God. You do.
Maybe you're in a storm. You didn't plan on it. It was completely unexpected. But you're in the middle of it, and you're wondering if you'll survive. Could be a physical storm. Maybe it's a relational storm with your spouse, your kids, your parents, or a friend. Maybe your financial boat is getting rocked by heavy waves. You're sinking deeper and deeper in debt and wondering if you'll ever be able to get your head above water again. Maybe it's an emotional storm. For you, the storm is internal. You're fighting a battle no one else can see. With depression, anxiety, or fear, you're in a storm. In Matthew chapter 8, the disciples found themselves in a literal storm on the Sea of Galilee. We pick it up in verse 23. Then Jesus got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Without warning, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. Now, before we even really start the story, I have to share with you an important fact. The disciples followed Jesus into that boat. If you go back to verse 18, you read this. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. It was Jesus' plan. It was Jesus' idea to be in that boat, on that sea, at that time. This may be the most important thing you learn today. Storms come even when you're following Jesus. If you're in a storm and you're wondering where you went wrong, I want to encourage you, this storm doesn't necessarily mean you've missed God. Some storms are of your own making. But often, storms come even though you're following Jesus.
Being a Christian never exempts you from a storm. Don't think that because you have a tough time, you're disobeying God. The disciples got in this storm because they obeyed God. Jesus said, get in the boat. They got in the boat and sailed right into a storm. They were right in the center of God's will, but in the middle of a storm. So when you're going through a tough time, do not automatically assume I must be out of the will of God, because you might be exactly where God wants you to be. Storms are impartial.
These disciples were not out of the will of God. Why were they in a storm? They were in a storm, don't miss this, they were in a storm because they were in the will of God. It was Jesus that constrained them to get into that boat. They were in this storm because they were obeying Jesus. Why would Jesus want them to be in a storm? Because he wanted them to grow. Now, I want to ask you a question. Those of you who've been on the trail for a while, when did you grow the most? When everything was fine? When you were smoothly sailing? Or when the storm came?
And sometimes God allows very difficult situations in our life to do what? To grow us up. And I think that if God allows a storm in your life, that its ultimate purpose is to bring you out stronger.
You will learn things in storms that you will never learn any other way.
A calm sea never produced a good sailor. How would you like to go on the seas with a sailor who had never been on troubled seas? If you're going to have a good life, it means you're going to go through stuff. But the purpose of that stuff isn't to harm you. God allows it or causes it to grow you up, to grow me up.
And the lesson is that Jesus can be trusted in the storms of life. And the only way you're ever going to prove that true is to go through them. That's it. If you'd never had a problem, you'd never know God could solve them.
It's God who is the master of the winds and the waves, and he's the one who causes storms to come. It is a shallow theology, a very shallow theology that says if we're in the will of God, that we're just going to sail always smoothly on the sea of life.
But you know, unfortunately, what I've learned is I don't grow really well when my flight is smooth. The times in my life that I have grown the most have been through the most violent turbulence. Things that I never would have picked, things that I never would have selected, things that I never would have asked for. Because when things were great, I was all about myself. But when I was overwhelmed, it was an opportunity to call out to God.
Find it very interesting that Jesus told him to get into a boat knowing the boat would go into a storm. He's God. He knew everything that would happen. There's a reason in it. There's something behind it. Christians aren't exempt from storms. But they are exempt from storms with no purpose. So if you feel like you're in the middle of one right now, I want you to know there's a purpose behind it. There's some reason behind it, because I actually believe it is storms are really the fitness, the spiritual fitness strategy of the believer. God's desire for your life is to make you strong in your faith. Those mountaintop moments, they're good for us, but they're not the thing that makes us stronger. It's those dark kind of moments in the storm that'll strengthen us to be who God's called us to be. Spurgeon says it this way: storms help to make the sailors sturdy, and trials help to make Christians strong in their faith. I want you strong in your faith.
You know what's cool in the middle of the storms of life? You don't hear a lot of stories about the disciples crossing the Galilee Sea with, it was a sunny day, the water was great, they were skiing. You don't hear about that story too often. You only hear about the storms, right? Because in the storms, in those hard moments, are the moments where you get to grow a little bit closer, grow a little bit deeper, and learn a little bit more about the Lord. He does things in the valley that can only be explained through him. He creates mountaintop moments in the middle of the valleys. Are you with me? And some of you, I'm not saying you should go chasing storms. I'm just telling you there is great joy and great reward even in the middle of the struggle. I just want to encourage you. I tell you today, I know the wilderness is a long way. The wilderness is hard. I'm just telling you, the Lord has great plans on the other side.
The disciples didn't expect the storm, but now this group, several of them, by the way, expert fishermen, were fighting for their lives as the waves threatened to sink their boat. The disciples thought they weren't going to make it. Jesus was so disturbed by the storm that he was taking a nap. Well, the disciples panicked. Jesus slept. Here's why that's so encouraging. It lets you know Jesus isn't intimidated by your storm. To you, it seems impossible, unending, devastating. Jesus, on the other hand, isn't frightened by it in the least.
So I wrote it down this way, okay? When it comes to your life, when it comes to the storm, ready? You can freak out. Only if Jesus is freaking out. You can stress if Jesus is stressed about your issue. You can panic all you want as long as Jesus is panicking. But if he's staying calm and restful and at peace in this moment, then I want you to know that's what we're called to live as believers also.